Do you ever feel like you get trapped in certain roles in friend groups? Like maybe you're always the supportive friend, and then your friend is always the silly jokester. How do we break out of these roles, learn new skills, and as I like to call it, become a social Swiss Army knife? My original inspiration for shooting this is that I suddenly realized within the last year that I always fall into the same role in social dynamics. Well, not every time. I think when we're around our childhood best friend or our family, maybe we act a little bit different. But at parties with people that I know moderately well, I generally fall into the role of person that asks curious, thoughtful questions about the other person. That's because I am curious. That's why I have this podcast to begin with. And that's why I'm excited to have guests on to ask them questions. But I started to become resentful. I might remember, oh, they had that intramural basketball game, and then ask someone about that. Oh, how did that basketball game go? I would constantly fall into this role of asking people more and more questions. And it's really only been a problem recently because I've come to rely on this skill set more and more. But let's relate this to you. My guess is that you fall into one of several roles. Let's list out a bunch right here. Maybe you fall into the role of the teacher because you love sharing things that you learned or explaining things. Maybe you're the storyteller, the person that knows how to make a tale of just when you went to the grocery store yesterday somehow captivating. Maybe you are the supportive listener we talked about earlier, but not so much from a question asking standpoint. You are instead a steady grounding presence in people's lives, a calming energy. Maybe you're the life of the party and you somehow add energy to a room where it wasn't there before. Maybe you are the jokester, and that can take many flavors. There is not only one type of jokester. There's the one that maybe makes some jokes at people's expense. Some people might find it bullying. Some people might just find it a certain type of humor that they enjoy. Maybe you're more of the entertainer or the silly one who would almost take the role of a court jester of sorts. Maybe you are someone that has a take charge energy. Maybe you stand up for people or point out when something needs to change. Or maybe that take charge energy follows a different path because you're the organizer or the one that always has a plan for the group. And while I could list more and more social dynamics, which maybe we'll get into that later in the episode, I think what matters most is also knowing that you probably don't fall into one of these roles, and it might vary depending on where you are. For instance, maybe you're the helper, but you're also the jokester. And both of these might serve the function of keeping the peace because maybe that's an underlying need of yours, and you either do that through helping out or lightening the mood. Some of this could loop back to deeper needs that you felt when you were growing up. Were you around a lot of tense arguments and you needed to find ways to either stir the pot to get your point across and let your voice be heard, or maybe again, you tried to regulate the mood in a different way to soften things? We often learn social dynamics when we're young or in different group settings, and then we will often fall into those roles later. Now, I am not the first person to think about this. This has roots in social psychology, organizational psychology, and systems theory. We could dive into this another time if we wanted to do a follow-up. I even met someone who is a systems theory psychologist who might come on the podcast sometime. But here, I really want to stay focused on one specific idea. It is the idea that whatever you were really good at and are really good at, it at first was an asset. It at first was so helpful to you, but then the more and more you came to rely on it, it became a crutch in a way that you stopped developing other areas or other social skill sets. Instead of having this Swiss Army knife that can operate in many ways in many different situations, you're just continually sharpening one knife in there, and now that's the only usable one. Now let's talk about why this is important or why this could be valuable. This is not about people pleasing or manipulation. This is about also enjoying conversations more, like the example that I talked about in the beginning. Sometimes people become resentful when they're always one thing. The friend that is always lending a helping hand to other people, they might genuinely enjoy that 100%, or maybe there's 10% of them that really want someone to look out for them too, but they don't know how to ask for help or take the other side of that social dynamic. So there's a lot of different directions we could take this. If we want to take the term role theory a little bit more the strict psychological definition sense, let's read from the American Psychological Association's website on the definition for this. A conceptual explanation of social behavior that assumes the individual's actions are defined in part by the role they occupy in a relationship, such as father, daughter, group member, leader, employee, boss, and so on. The theory suggests that by enacting roles, individuals establish exchange relationships with one another, building interdependence that is essential for social coordination. Okay, so this also brings up the point that sometimes having defined roles just makes things make sense. For instance, if your boss, let's assume this is not in a weird harassment way, but started tickling you and talking about in some weird goofy voice, "Don't you like my pink polka dots?" I don't know, just acting like really weird. I don't know why. That's just the weirdest thing I could think that a boss would do, just sort of like acting like a clown. But that wouldn't make sense. It would be really confusing to you. It would mess up the dynamic that needs to be professional. So, sorry, I don't know why. Sometimes I need to sit and actually outline these. Usually I do that some, but then when I try to think of examples off the top of my head, things like that happen. But my point is that having defined roles is not always bad. Now, if you want a follow-up video after this that goes into how we're often different around different people, I touch, I believe, quite a bit on that in my episode called Is Personality an Illusion? And I will link that down below. You could either watch it on YouTube or listen on the podcast version. I think something that I might have touched on there, but I definitely want to here is the idea that in a certain group, let's take a show that a lot of people have seen, The Office. Actually, that's ironic because Michael Scott doesn't act like a typical boss. So then that whole role theory actually gets kind of changed, which is part of what leads to some of the comedy of the show. But you might have someone like Michael Scott who then takes up so much of the space energetically. And then other people, Pam almost kind of shrinks in his presence in the beginning of the series, but that might just be from comfortability. But it's also like when one person takes one role, the other person often goes into another role. And that's probably something that you've noticed. And that's why I brought up it depends on where you are. Like you might be the quote outgoing one in a certain setting where that role is not filled, but then you go somewhere else and maybe your best friend's friend is really just a lot. So then you sort of hang back a bit because it's like, where do you even fit in that? Before we continue, I think it would be good to get out a bunch of different types because we only covered a few earlier and also cover some early research on this topic. While they were not the first to talk about different roles or group dynamics, Benny and Sheets, and I will link some of their research down below, did study different roles people take on in group dynamics. Now, their research looked at when a task was trying to be achieved, what are the different roles that different people take on. And I will also link an article by University of Pittsburgh that breaks down all of these different roles. For instance, they had a whole bucket of roles that all focused on completing the task at hand, from the coordinator to the energizer to the evaluator or critic. And think about even just at something like a book club. Someone might take on the role of keeping everyone focused on the task at hand when the conversation drifts too far off. Then another group of type of roles they discussed is group building or maintenance roles. They really help with keeping the interpersonal relationships in a harmonious state. So this could be someone such as the encourager, someone that gives positive feedback. Or the harmonizer, which loops back to what we talked about, someone that might focus on reducing tension. So depending on where you're reading about this, there might be different names for these types of roles. Then lastly, we get to self-centered roles such as the dominator or blocker, help seeker. Now that might seem counterintuitive, but this person, they do block progress from happening by acting as though they're helpless and they can't contribute. Now, moving away from the research and just going back to my list, I want to list out any that we haven't gotten to yet. And speaking of that person that falls into the helpless role, this makes me think of people that might often feel as though they're a victim and maybe they are the storyteller, but often what they're really wanting out of that is some sort of empathy. Or a different type of validation seeking could be someone that really needs their accomplishments to be seen, so they have persistent validation seeking.
which is understandable and probably comes from things from their past, but constantly resorting to those behaviors can put a strain on certain group dynamics. I think of within the role of an organizer, someone might be the person to research the certain restaurant. You guys are out wandering around looking for a bar to go to next, and they're the person that will find the next place the group should go to. There might be someone that listens quite a bit, but always chimes in with unsolicited advice. Or we have sort of the flirt or the seductress who might not always be flirting with people that they're attracted to. They might enjoy winning other people over or almost being in sort of a sales role in lots of different relationship dynamics that they're in. And then finally, a connector, someone that enjoys connecting other people or giving recommendations. They sort of see themselves as a bridge between different people or concepts or events, art exhibits they've been to. And of course, before we continue, comment down below if there are some that you think I left out. Some of them I didn't mention here if I felt that they were covered under a different umbrella we've already covered, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this of other different roles people take on in group dynamics.
Okay, so reasons that you might want to consider developing other tools in your toolkit. One is that it limits our social abilities. For instance, if you're always the jokester, maybe people don't take you seriously, or it's hard for you to feel like you can even come out of your shell in a professional environment because that's the only way you know how to be outgoing or connect with people. Someone that only knows how to talk to the opposite sex, for instance, through flirting with them, could have a hard time relating to their partner's friend or their coworker in a way that doesn't set up that other dynamic that they're not really trying to. It also flattens our relationships with others. They only see us in a one-dimensional way versus seeing us as a whole human. We even feel restricted. Kind of like we talked about relying on a crutch. I almost feel that energetically. If you don't have full access to all of these other colors, all of these other ways of being, I equate this to sort of like a dancer who's not only able to dance with hip hop or jazz, but they can also get down on the floor and do floor work. The world is open to them. And then that's how we can feel socially. It also, like we talked about, prevents you from being resentful. Maybe the friend that often falls into the role of being like a therapist for their friends feels drained after a coffee date with a friend because they didn't have to do that, but that's just what they tend to do. So this adaptability can help you professionally, it can help you personally with friends, with family, and it can also help when you're with different types of groups. For instance, I think I started also noticing that I wanted to work on this area when I was in group settings. That is not the place for thoughtful, curious questions that are a little bit deeper. It's just not. It's not fun. It doesn't necessarily fit the current vibe that's going on. So if everyone's sort of just throwing out one-liners or, I don't know, just having more casual conversations, I know that small talk gets a bad rap, and I'll be the first in line to make fun of it and encourage something deeper. Again, partly why I have this podcast, but there's a time and a place for it. We don't need to walk up to someone and talk about something really thought-provoking. Sometimes it feels a little bit lighter. It feels a little bit easier to just occasionally talk about something like the sports game that was on last night or the TV show they're watching. And again, this gives, I almost picture it like not just a rainbow, but think about frequencies of a wave. Some are high and some are low, and that variability, I think, feels really good to us as humans. Maybe you are the friend that always makes light of something because it's harder for you to go deeper. And then maybe you don't actually feel that close to anyone in your life because vulnerability is very difficult. You don't have to jump into the deep end too quickly, even just something small such as, how's the family doing? Well, I don't know, you might already do that, but this would be an action step for no matter what kind of role you usually fall into. Try on a different role for a moment. It could be, if you're usually the quiet observer, practice telling a story at dinner. Borrow from other people. Watch what roles your friends naturally step into, or a coworker, and try their approach. Again, this is not about trying to be someone else, A, for manipulation, or B, someone you're not.
So let's now also talk about why this isn't, quote, not being yourself. The way I would think about it instead is this is expanding who you are. It's liberating yourself to be more of yourself and tapping into parts of yourself that have maybe laid dormant for many years. When we're children, we are so free to tap into all these different parts of ourselves. We have moments where we're curious. We have moments where we're letting people see us sad and vulnerable. We have moments where we're playful and silly. We have moments where we just want to be quiet and observe and listen. And then I think the older we get, the more we rely on certain aspects of ourselves. And to go back to how this is still being yourself, in fact, more of yourself rather than changing who you are, it's expanding who you are. Let's dive a little deeper into that. A lot of philosophers would ask, who even are you really? Are you your past, your present? Are you who you could be? Buddhists believe that the self is fluid and not fixed. There are a lot of directions we could turn for inspiration for this in history, but I'd like to just anchor this because this is a more personal one in a personal story from someone I know who changed a lot. There was someone that I grew up with who I didn't see a lot for a while. And then we were hanging out in a group with a bunch of people they knew at this later stage in life. And this person seemed so different. And because we're very close, I felt comfortable talking to them about it later. And I said, hey, I'm having a hard time hanging out around you. You seem like really fake. You seem really different. And then they called me out in a way that was actually very needed. They said, just because I didn't used to act like this doesn't mean that this isn't me. And they basically talked about giving them room to be who they are now. And that's so true. And I think that we can do that for ourselves. Sometimes we don't even know who we are unless we try on. I keep turning to this as the outfit analogy, but unless we try on these different outfits, how do we even know who we are? How do you know you're not a great storyteller if you never try to tell the story? How do you know that you can't be the person that is great at planning things or hosting if you've never tried it before? And even if you do try it, it might not go great the first time, but you can keep trying it and layer on more parts of yourself to be more dynamic.
In fact, something you could ask yourself as you are doing this is, am I trying to control the situation, or am I just trying to have a little bit more fun and grow my social skills in a new way by trying on, again, I think of it as trying on a different outfit. The reason why this will help you talk to anyone, the reason why this is for your benefit is because there are certain situations where other people, they have not done this work. They only have one way of relating to people. You can meet that person where they're at. I was looking at I have not read this book. Just read the back cover of it. It's probably good. I probably should read it, but it seemed fascinating. It was Super Communicators by Charles Duhigg, and I was looking through it at a bookstore this weekend. And essentially I saw on the back cover, what I would think he was getting at is that there are three kinds of conversations people are often having. Either a what is this about conversation, a how are we feeling conversation, or a who are we conversation. I was recently at an event where people were talking about a lot of their accomplishments and how lucky they felt. It could have been viewed as bragging. It could have been viewed as gratitude. It could have just been viewed as catching up and trying to fill people in on what they've been up to. But I realized that they were having a who are we conversation. I think that for them, being seen in a certain way and establishing a who are we was really important. And if I was having a what are we talking about conversation, just trying to talk about the facts, I would not have connected with them that well. You could choose to experiment in low stakes settings. For instance, hanging out with your best friend or someone very non-judgmental versus trying this at a party where you don't know anyone and you feel a little bit intimidated. And finally, awareness can be a comfort zone. You don't have to try anything that you're not ready to, but when you notice yourself doing something, it can open up things in new ways. For instance, realizing, yes, the conversation is mostly about the other person. If you are asking 10 questions in a row, they are going to talk. And not because they're selfish or not because they don't care about you. I mean, sometimes people do just want to talk, but sometimes it's because you've set up this dynamic. So we can also ask the question, which I think is always useful to ask, what role am I playing in this situation? Awareness and noticing what skills you need to improve, knowing that it might take time, knowing that it might take a little bit of practice. You're not going to just suddenly try something for the first time and be perfect at it because, again, you've probably been relying on certain ways of showing up in the world, and then other ways might take practice. If you're always the life of the party, it might feel hard to keep your mouth shut and listen for a bit and just let other people talk. You might almost feel like a pull towards you of, oh, I want to say this, I want to say this, and then that's a skill to practice. So I would love to hear from you. This one was a bit more off the cuff, just casual thoughts based on things that have been floating around in my head for a few months. And yeah, I'd love to hear if any of this resonates or what you think. If you are not subscribed, you can subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple, or wherever you are that you are listening to this show. And speak with you next week.